The latest headlines.
Hard to imagine them not as one of the best teams in history.
The insightful interviews.
Jared Greenberg, NBA TV.
Virtually all teams in basketball could have paid Kevin Durant what the Warriors paid him.
The hottest takes.
Go and play for a team talented as Golden State and win a championship.
Can all be found on Press Row. Broadcasting is part of the Brew Sports Network. Here's your host.
It doesn't matter what your name is.
Christian Heimall.
I don't know if it was Mark Zuckerberg in 2004 in his dorm room in Boston or if it was the guys who invented Twitter just a couple of years later. But at some point, there was someone who decided that the world of journalism was going to change drastically. There were going to be two different types of people. There were going to be your honest, truthful, integrity-driven journalists who offer the facts, simply those, without opinion, and without malice or intent. Then there were going to be journalists who decided that in the social media age and the ability to catch fire with a headline or with a quote or a snippet from a celebrity was how you gain your notoriety. I don't know how that changed, but gotcha journalism has become prevalent in our social media society, and there was a victim of it over the weekend. Welcome on Press Row. I'm your host, Christian Heimall. Glad to be back with you once again, our fourth installment of the show. We took it on the road this week. You're going to hear a couple of different people hear from Tommy D, the founder emeritus of the KnicksBlog.com for Sportsnet New York, as well as a contributor to Patreon.com. He's going to talk to us about the firing of Phil Jackson by the Knicks and what the Chris Paul deal and trade means for Carmelo Anthony's potential future and for the Knicks as well. You're also going to hear from a good friend, Mark Ernay. He is a sports director and morning anchor at 1010 Wins in New York City. We recorded about a half hour talking with one another on the road in Ramapo, New York. A little bit of vacation this week, so still on the grind, still making things work for you guys. Glad to be a part of the show once again, as always. If you'd like to get in touch with me on social media, you can find me at Chris Heimall. You can also get in touch with our folks at Brew Sports Network at Brew Sports Net. Brought it up in the opening, and it caught a lot of fire on Sunday and Monday. The comments made by John McEnore regarding Serena Williams, and we'll touch on this with Mark Ernay in just a little bit. But it's one of those things that bothers me, and I really kind of have to put a lot of the blame on the NPR reporter who was interviewing McEnore, because McEnore didn't make a statement about Serena Williams. He answered a question. He's promoting his book called But Seriously, and in it he calls Serena Williams the greatest female tennis player ever. And that is some high praise for a woman with as great a story as she has. 23 Grand Slam titles. She has done so much for the sport. And to call her the greatest female tennis player of all time, with the likes of Steffi Graf and Martina Navratilova still out there and Chris Everett, is astounding. The problem that I have is that the journalist, and I'm using air quotes in that, tries to lead John McEnroe down a rabbit hole and say, why qualify it? Some would say she's the greatest tennis player of all time. She offers no proof of anybody saying that. She offers no one person. She is merely making an opinion upon herself, trying to get John to say something that would be gotcha journalism. The problem is, John went out and said it. He said she's not, because if she played on the men's side of things, she would be ranked 700th in the world. Well, you know what? It is what it is. Serena has even said 4 years ago in 2013, she said on the David Letterman show that she wouldn't be able to beat Andy Roddick. She wouldn't even get a game off of him, saying how different the two sports, men's and women's tennis, actually are. So you can't really be mad at John McEnroe for answering a question that right now there's no proof to the contrary. There is no proof saying that Serena wouldn't be ranked 700th in the world or wouldn't be able to consistently beat the 700th ranked player in the world. She's a tremendous talent. She's the greatest female athlete. I'll even go as far as say athlete in the world. But for someone to go in there and try to lead someone who you are interviewing down that rabbit hole, down to say something that can be fueled as controversial in a social media age and get a lot of publicity, that to me is wrong. I hate that. I can't stand that. And I really wish journalism, it happens a lot in sports, I really wish journalists wouldn't do that. You cover the subject, you present the facts, you do an interview with someone like John McEnroe, and that's it. You don't have to try to make a statement or make a comment about someone for your own personal gain, if that's even what's happening. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but it really bothers me when people do that type of thing just so that you ask those type of questions or make those type of comments just to try to get someone to respond and say something that is considered quote-unquote worse or more, offensive. And the people who are bringing race into it, stop. That's really dumb. Really, really, really dumb. And has no basis in this argument whatsoever. But, it's going to get John McEnore a lot more publicity. It might get his book a lot more publicity. I love Serena's comment back to him, but I didn't think it was warranted, especially when Serena has even gone as far to say that she knows she wouldn't be able to beat some of the best men's tennis players in the world. It's just how it is. It's just how I feel. Like I said, we got a lot to talk about here coming up. It's interesting, this whole Phil Jackson deal. We'll talk with Tommy D in just a little bit. It's funny how things turn when the other shoe drops. And Phil Jackson, I don't think this does anything to his legacy. He's still going to be one of the greatest coaches of all time, but he wanted to be Pat Riley. He wanted to be Jerry West. He wanted to be these other great coaches who became great executives, and he couldn't do it. I don't know who's to blame for that, whether it's Carmelo, whether it's Porzingis, whether it's Phil himself, or whether it's, I don't know, maybe the guy who owns the team, James Dolan. I said this for years with the Raiders. They were never going to be relevant again until Al Davis gave up ownership. It's unfortunate that he passed, but Raiders are back. If James Dolan gives up ownership of the New York Knicks and they have someone else there who's not, playing with his band on draft night instead of being there, that may be better. But there's a lot of different issues that go on in the Knicks, and I don't think Phil Jackson was the biggest one. I think he was a big part of the problem. The triangle offense does not work in today's NBA. Today's NBA is not a coach's NBA. It is a player's NBA, and we've seen that with LeBron getting GM after GM fired, coach after coach fired. We've seen that with how much these players command in terms of their salaries, in terms of their deals to be able to move on to different areas and different places. I'm not at all surprised by it. The triangle will not work because there's not a single player who wants to play in it, because they want to play in a more spaced offense, in a more fluid motion type offense that you see like in Houston with Mike D'Antoni, or you see in Golden State with Steve Kerr. Those are the type of coaches that succeed because they let their players play. And Phil Jackson didn't want that. He didn't want that, and it was ultimately his demise in New York. But there are bigger issues in Madison Square Garden than whoever the president is of the Knicks. So what they do now, who knows? Because they can't get Chris Paul because he's going to Houston. And who knows what that does. I mean, that deal kind of baffles me. It's a steal for the Rockets, but only if Chris Paul and James Harden know how to share the ball together. It's still James Harden's team. He'll still be the primary point guard. I don't know how well Chris Paul can play off the ball as a two guard, and I don't know if James Harden would want to play off the ball. I think he would be a lot better at that if your starting lineup includes Chris Paul at the point and Harden over there at shooting guard. I think that's your best option, but I don't know if James Harden wants to give up the ball that much, because he was one of the top three players, maybe the number one player in terms of how long they held the ball during this season. And he's a great talent, and it's a great system for both of them, but they're going to have to find a way to work together to be able to make it happen. That's going to be the biggest thing. I don't fully understand it. I don't fully agree with it, but at the same time, we're saying this in late June. And if we're still saying it come late April next year, then we know it was an issue. But either way, it seems as though the Clippers, a team that was once thought to be that true super team, is no longer there and will not be there for a while. It's a heavy rebuild coming up for the Clippers. So Tinseltown is once again a Lakers city, and we'll see exactly how far that goes for the rest of the season. As I mentioned, we've taken the show on the road a little bit. Coming up now, I want you guys to sit back, relax, and enjoy a fun conversation with one of the more well-versed sports journalists in the industry. He is the sports director at 1010 Wins and the morning anchor for 1010 Wins, the largest all-news radio station in the country, the first all-news radio station in the country. Mark Ernay and I had a great conversation earlier this week about a number of different things in not only sports, but in media as well. On Press Row, we're recording today's episode of Press Row from Palisades Credit Union Park in Ramapo, New York, home of the Rockland Boulders of the Can-Am Independent League of Professional Baseball. I'm Christian Heimall. Happy to be with you guys as always, and a special guest co-host here, at least for the first half of the show. A good friend of mine, the sports director, morning anchor at 1010 Wins, the first all-news radio station in the United States, which began in 1964. He hasn't been there since then. We'll give him some credit there. But a good friend of mine, Mark Ernay. Mark, thanks a lot for joining me.
Good to be with you, pal. How you been?
I'm wonderful. And obviously you're there in the thick of it with the New York City. So we'll dive right into some of the bigger issues, I guess, that have popped up throughout New York. And I guess the number one that everybody talks about from an issue standpoint is, of course, Phil Jackson and what he has been doing as president of the New York Knicks. And I talked to a couple of people. I've talked with Jared Greenberg of NBA TV, who you know well, and I've talked with a couple of other people. And none of them seem to think that this tarnishes his legacy as a coach or as a basketball mind. But the franchise is in very much a state of chaos since he's taken over, is it not?
Well, is it really? I mean, it was in a state of chaos before he came here. The legacy as a coach obviously can't be impacted by what's going on, and this really is his first time as the president of a team overseeing, Bill Parcells used to say, shopping for the groceries. And to that end, outside of maybe the drafting of Kristaps Porzingis, you'll have to forgive me, I'm on 2 hours sleep. Outside the drafting of Kristaps Porzingis a couple of years ago, and Willie Hernan-Gomez, who was all NBA first rookie team this year, there hasn't really been a lot of positive to show for the Phil Jackson regime. Obviously, the situation with KP before the draft last week made it a circus-like atmosphere. The situation that's developed with Carmelo Anthony, with Phil very publicly stating that he thinks Carmelo should seek opportunity as an opportunity to win a championship elsewhere. Melo does have a no-trade clause, so Phil can't just up and get rid of him.
Right.
Send him packing as much as he would like to. So if the Knicks really do want Carmelo Anthony out of town, it's going to cost them a pretty penny. And, on top of all that, who really wants to come play for the Knicks right now? And this was a situation going back to even the Amari Stoudemire acquisition, when the Knicks figured, and this was before Phil got to town, that if they had Amari Stoudemire and Carmelo Anthony, that guys would want to come play here.
Right.
Well, they had some guys who came to play, J.R. Smith for one. In fact, a handful of guys who won a championship last year with the Cavaliers, J.R. Smith and Iman Shumpert among them. The Knicks are, sadly, at least for their fan base, we think no closer to a championship than they were even 2 years before Phil showed up. If you remember Mike Woodson's first season as head coach, 54 wins.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And that's where the building point should have been. But they've gone nowhere but backwards since.
It almost feels as if Phil Jackson wanted to become Pat Riley, in a sense of how to build a franchise. And he hasn't done that, obviously. But you have to give him credit in the sense of Porzingis, and I think that's why we didn't see the typical New York Knicks boo at the draft selection of the young man, the point guard from France, in the first round of the NBA draft. But that being said, it's almost as if he is taking that coach's mentality of how to punish a player to the front office, and that doesn't seem to be working in this players' NBA, at least.
That's what it seems like. You mentioned Frank Ntilikina, who was their number one pick with the 8th overall last week. And I think there are a couple of reasons he wasn't lustily booed. Number one, compared to the last French guy the Knicks drafted in Frederick Weiss, they actually know a little bit more about this guy. And he was genuinely excited in the pre-draft to be on the Knicks' radar. and he said he had a good meeting with Phil and the rest of the Brain Trust, which is great. And the Knicks certainly need somebody to run the show. So if this is going to be their guy, their point guard for the next 10 years, fantastic. What happens with the triangle? I think, this is the issue that the Knicks fans are trying to reconcile, is that, and it's a terrible pun, but the triangle offense is like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. It just doesn't work. Or is it the round peg in the square? No, the round peg will go in the square hole. The square peg won't go generally in the round hole. And the triangle just does not work because most of the players in the NBA don't want to play it.
Right.
It's as simple as that. And the current Knick structure, as far as the roster goes, it's not conducive to playing the triangle. Let's remember, Phil excelled at the triangle with Michael Jordan and then Kobe Bryant.
Right.
He doesn't have either of those guys, and even if he did, they're too old now to matter. But that's the issue, and it's too far in a concept. It won't work. And the ironic thing is, Mike D'Antoni, the former Knicks coach, named Coach of the Year with the Rockets this year, and he's been able to play his, what they call a pace and space game, that when he was with the Knicks, people had a hard time buying into that. But obviously it works to a degree because he had a terrific season with the Rockets, and James Harden, bought in from the get-go. And if your star player buys in, then you can sell it to the rest of the guys from, the number one all the way to the end of the bench. The problem with the Knicks is because Carmelo's not buying into the triangle, nobody else will either.
Speaking with Mark Ernay, the sports director at 1010 Wins and Morning anchor for them as well here on Press Row. And when we talk the NBA this offseason, it's going to be a lot about it. At least the talk so far, leading up to the draft and now after the draft, has been teams positioning themselves for next summer when so many players could potentially opt out. LeBron James being obviously the biggest one. Will Paul George end up with the Lakers and all of those things? Is Carmelo going to end up with the Clippers and everybody else? The idea, and I just want to get your take on this because you've seen a lot more basketball than I have.
I'm not that much older. No, I probably am.
The idea of a super team isn't new.
No.
Just for whatever reason, it seems as though we're upset about it now, and I think a lot of that has to do with the level of talent when LeBron came in. Between LeBron and the rest of the league, it was clear in a way that he was the best player.
Right.
And Michael Jordan was clear in a way the best player at that. But you had guys like a Charles Barkley, like Hakeem Olajuwon, who were still in the league. Bird and Magic, the two best players in the league, they weren't teaming up because they were on super teams.
Right.
Just people, for whatever reason, didn't want to talk about that. You've seen a lot more basketball. The idea of the super team, it's not new. Why is it now that we seem to vilify a guy from going from a great team and a great franchise that was in the finals once but never built around him, then he goes to the team that's ready to maybe win a championship, and we vilify Kevin Durant?
See, that's why. Because he went to the team that knocked them out of the finals, the conference.
Is it
finals.
that simple? Where if
No,
Golden
I
State
really
doesn't
think that's it.
match up with the Thunder, that nobody cares about Durant leaving?
Because they wouldn't have been so close you could taste it. Because they were, and you say, okay, you come back next year a little bit hungrier, a little bit angrier, and with a little bit more purpose, and you make sure that your team gets over the top somehow and past the Warriors. The fact that he went and jumped ship to the Warriors, to me it would almost be like the Jets for all these years have problems beating Tom Brady. And I know this will hit right at home for you. Tom Brady decides, after years and years and years, if the shoe were on the other foot, that he can't beat the Jets, I'm going to go play for the Jets.
Darrell Revis, basically.
Well, Darrell Revis was
he went and got his championship,
right?
too.
But it was a little bit different because it wasn't direct.
Right.
It wasn't. He didn't go the first year and go play for the Patriots. He spent some time in Tampa Bay and I think somewhere else. But that's and football is a lot different than basketball. I think that's the biggest issue that people have is that he went to the team that ended their run last year and ended it so decisively because they were up 3-1.
Right.
And the irony, of course, is that the Warriors were then up 3-1 on the Cavaliers and wound up losing the championship in 7 games. And I think that's the bigger issue is that, you're going to this team already that had last year, over 70 wins, set the record with the longest winning streak to start a season and all this stuff. And they did that without their head coach, who was out because of back issues. And now you go and you join the enemy. And it would have been like Patrick Ewing going to the Bulls back in the day, or the Pacers, who gave the Knicks so many problems over the years. the other thing, too, is the glut of social media. It makes it so much easier to trash a guy.
Yep.
You know, you don't have to wait for somebody in the paper the next day to read a quote. You're doing it instantaneously. And, you know, I go back to, very quickly off the topic, with John McEnroe's comments about Serena Williams. It's unbelievable. It's nothing that hasn't been said before.
It seems as though, and I was going to bring up John McEnroe, actually, because it seems though in the age of social media, there is now a gotcha type of journalism. And where some people, and this isn't for all journalists, you've worked with a number of great ones who would would go near this, but it seems that multiple journalists want to catch a celebrity in that gotcha moment. And I don't know the NPR reporter from a hole in the wall, but it seemed as though she was in a courtroom. It would have been called leading the witness. It seemed as though she was trying to lead McEnroe into a gotcha moment. The problem was McEnroe went down the rabbit hole and made the 700.
I mean, that's who John McEnroe is,
right?
And it's nothing he hasn't said before. It's just that we're in an environment now where, because it was posted on social media, it caught fire, such as it was, and everybody jumped all over it. And the venom that I saw from people starting late yesterday morning and into last night about how dare John McEnroe say this about Serena Williams. First of all, he wasn't trashing her. He said she's the greatest female player of all time. That's some pretty exclusive company. If you think about the Billie Jean Kings and the Chris Everetts and the Martina Navratilova and Steffi Graf, there are tons of players. She's the best of them ever. Margaret Smith Court, she's the best. The question was, well, some people would say she's the greatest of all time, male or female. And that's where John's not the only one who has an issue with this.
Right.
Serena herself has said if she played Andy Murray, she wouldn't get a game off Andy Murray. Now, listen, it's a stretch, I think, to say she wouldn't get a game off Andy Murray in 2 sets, whether she could compete or beat on a regular basis the 700th ranked player in the world. Okay, maybe that's a little over the top. Maybe 700.
I think
was the
that's
wrong
what
number.
people got more upset was the 700. If he
No,
said,
you know what?
If he said
I
she
don't
was
think
50,
so. I don't think so, because if he had said she couldn't compete in the top 100, he still would have gotten hammered, because there are people who just want to be angry.
That's
and
true.
I saw it on Twitter last night. I was just pointing out the fact because people were calling it a statement. He didn't make a statement. He answered a question. There's a huge difference. I'm a journalist. I understand the difference. And I appreciate the difference. You know, if somebody stands there on a soapbox and makes a proclamation, that's a statement.
Right.
This was the answer to a question. And yes, maybe a leading question. But John McEnroe has never shied away from answering a question.
Right. And according to John, he has even been offered money to go and play Serena and those type of things. And he has said that at 54, which, you know, he doesn't want to, or he feels he could still beat her, but every athlete is going to think that they're still at the top of their game.
And there's no reason for them to have to prove it. You know, you go back 15 or so years ago, there was a guy named Karsten Brach who was just outside the top 200 and played a set against Venus, played a set against Serena, beat them both. Okay, that's the 200, and it's 1 set. Now, does that mean that she could never beat a player in the top 200? Of course not.
Right.
Any given day, anything can happen. We saw it today. Top seeds in a tournament warm up for Wimbledon, got knocked out. You know, the 5th-ranked player in the world gets knocked out by the guy ranked 222nd. It happens every day. Buster Douglas beat Mike Tyson. Anything can happen. And I'm not comparing Serena Williams playing a top one. I don't want angry emails and tweets. I'm not saying that Serena Williams can't beat somebody in the top 700. She could. But on a regular basis, is John McEnroe right? He's probably closer to right than he is
given
wrong.
the social media age, that's where the venom really came from. That's where this really caught fire, was because of social. If that statement or that question had been asked in 2003, nobody cares.
It probably dies a very quick
yes.
death. It disappears into the ether, and that's the end of it. The other thing, too, is it took on a racial component, which is really what made me angry, because it's not racial. People are saying, well, a black commentator would never have said anything like that. First of all, how many black tennis male commentators are there outside of James Blake? There aren't very many. There aren't very many female black tennis commentators. Zena Garrison used to do it, Shonda Rubin on occasion. There aren't very many. That sample size is very small. So to make it a racial issue, it wasn't. John McEnroe's not racist. John McEnroe says things maybe that he shouldn't say, but this was not racial. This was not racist. He was just saying he doesn't think she can compete with the top 700 on a regular basis, and we'll never know, so it doesn't matter.
He's Mark Renee, sports director at 1010 Wins. I'm Christian Heimall. You're on Press Row, and when we're in New York, and I've talked about this with a couple of other people, the biggest story this summer outside of Madison Square Garden has been Aaron Judge, and has been how talented this young man is. And there's nobody happier in the world about Aaron Judge and Phil Jackson than Sandy Alderson over in Queens, and what has gone on the dumpster fire that has re-become the Mets this year after the last couple of seasons. But look at this New York Yankees squad, and I've asked this to a number of different people. Do they have the pitching to sustain their offense throughout this year and really make a run of the division title?
Well, we've seen over the last few weeks, really over the last month and a half, they started out like gangbusters, had a great first 30 games. The last 43 before last night, they were 5 under 500. Long term, there are issues there. Tanaka was supposed to be the ace. He's been anything but. All the other guys who not a lot was expected of are all pitching, for the most part, pretty well. Pineda's been very spotty lately. Jordan Montgomery has been a revelation.
CeCe was back to 2011.
Yeah, he was phenomenal. And now the injuries are starting to catch up with them a little bit. Sabathia is still out. Castro went on the DL today with a hamstring. Aaron Hicks with an oblique. He's out for a month. CeCe's going to be out for a little while longer with his hamstring trouble. So it's a matter of staying healthy. And it's just a matter, I think one of the issues around here is that Yankee fans seem to think that baseball was invented in the mid-'90s when Derek Jeter came. And they won a bunch of championships over Jeter's career. I understand that. But, you forget, and some weren't even around for it, but the early 90s when the Mets ran New York and ruled New York, and it really was a Mets town, and the Yankees in the Stump Merrill years were from hunger, you have to understand that the Yankees aren't that bad, but they were expected to be about that bad. And the fact that they are in contention, and here we are sitting on June 27th, they're tied for first place, that's house money. Enjoy it. Appreciate it. Don't sell off the farm to make a run. You weren't ready to make a run this year anyway.
Right.
There's no need to bring up Clint Frazier. There's no need to bring up Chase Adams. Let these guys season themselves. When they're ready, they'll be here. It's the same thing with the Mets and Ahmed Rosario and Dominic Smith. They're going, bring them up. No, just relax. Nothing's going to happen. If you need them, they'll come up. We don't want them to fail. If they fall on their faces and everybody, they're not ready, they're terrible, trade them. Because, again, this is, the social media world.
Right.
And if you go 0 for 5 in your first game, that's it. Your career is over. You're terrible. You're a waste of time. The Yankees and their fans really do need to appreciate everything that's happened so far this year. Yes, ride the wave of Aaron Judge, who is still at or near the top of all three Triple Crown categories in the American League. This guy has been a revelation. When he struck out half of his at-bats last season, nobody expected this.
Right.
Going into spring training, we were talking about, I coined them, not that I'm going to get any money for it, but I coined the Killer G's, Greg Bird and Gary Sanchez. Greg Bird hasn't played hardly a lick this year. Gary Sanchez missed a month. Aaron Judge has been the story.
Right.
And the Yankees needed a story. Now, the other part of the story is that they're tied for first place, which is fantastic. But if they should fall off the face of the earth and wind up third in the American League East and not make the playoffs this year, is the season a failure? Absolutely not.
With Mike Trout's injury, is it his MVP to lose right now, or is there another player out there that has the numbers that nobody's talking about just because maybe they're a little bit more of a veteran than Aaron Judge?
Still way too early to think about that. You remember Gary Sanchez came up July, I think it was around the All-Star break, and everybody wanted him to win Rookie of the Year. He played 80 games, not even. It's way too early to start looking at MVPs. Yes, there's a conversation, but you can't make your final list of 3 or 5 on June 27th and tell me right now, with any degree of certainty, that Aaron Judge is going to sustain these numbers and he's going to have 58 home runs come September 27th, and he'll be batting .330 and he'll have 120 RBIs. If that's the case, absolutely, put him on the list of finalists for MVP. But I've seen so much baseball over the years. Guys come, guys go. Kevin Moss, Shane Spencer, Charbonneau with the Indians back 35 years ago, maybe longer now. There are flashes in the pan. I'm not saying Judge is that, but let's let it happen.
we've got about 3 months left in the season, but only about a month left in the trade deadline. And the other day, there were tweets and rumors going around about which Mets players are available. Does it shock you at all to see some of those names out there? Does it make sense for the Mets to be big-time sellers come the deadline with all these injuries?
I think if they can get anywhere close to 500 between now and the All-Star break in a week and a half, that maybe that'll change. Mm-hmm. But if the All-Star break comes in 12 days and the Mets are still 7 or 8 or 10 games under 500, then maybe you have to look at selling off. And I wouldn't go much beyond the potential free agents. The Dudas, the Grandersons, the Jay Bruces. Mm-hmm. The pitchers, certainly Jerry Blevins and Addison Reed might actually bring something back. But I'm not going to, I'm not going to take, for example, I heard this crazy thing out of Houston, I think, Jacob deGrom to the Astros
You're not getting Lance McCullers and George Springer.
No. Who's the kid who's a Yankee fan? Bregman?
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah.
Yep.
DeGrom for Bregman and blah, 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 and McCullers. And it might not even have been McCullers. It might have been somebody else.
Right.
But it's just, no. The Mets are not going to... He's their ace. They're not trading their Doc Gooden. That's, they did that once before. They're not going to let that happen again.
He's Mark Renee, sports director at 1010 Wins. You're on Press Row. I'm Christian Heimall. And just real quick before we wrap things up, I want to get your take on a couple of other things that we saw go around. I mean, we touched on John McEnore. We touched on a number of other topics here, focusing mainly in the New York City sports market. But when you go nationally, some of the biggest topics that really haven't been talked about, I should say, are on the lesser-known sports like a golf, for instance. But Jordan Spieth got a lot of attention for how he won the Travelers Championship this past week. And I brought this up on my show last week. I find it hard to believe that golf can succeed when it seems like when in a team sport, when one team dominates, like it's the Cavaliers or the Warriors or the Patriots, everybody hates that team.
Right.
But when one guy dominates, like a Tiger Woods, everybody loves that player. We don't have that in golf. And I've been wondering, where is the face of golf? Is it Jordan Spieth? We thought it was a couple of years ago. We thought it was going to be Rory McIlroy. He was going to take the throne from Tiger. But with Jordan with guys like Rory missing the cut, guys like Jason Day and Dustin Johnson having injuries and missing cuts in major tournaments, it doesn't feel like there's a face of golf.
And there may not be, but does there need to be? I mean, I understand that the TV networks want to focus on somebody. One of the things we've seen over the years, especially with Tiger, is no matter where he was on the leaderboard, somehow he wound up on the first page with the graphic when they showed it as they went to commercial, just to make sure everybody, even if he was 10 shots off the lead, they would find a way to put him on there so that people would be able to trace him or track him. I don't know that there needs to be. I think if there are engaging personalities, and the guys you mentioned for the most part are engaging personalities. Justin Thomas is another one, up and comer. Played on the Ryder Cup team. A guy actually this time last year I had never heard of, which I thought was I thought somebody was punking me when they brought up Justin Thomas's name. Like, I've never heard of this guy. I thought they were talking about Dave Thomas, the Wendy's guy. I didn't know. There are guys out there that viewers will watch, that fans will take to, and Phil Mickelson was a name that we didn't even bring up. Didn't play the Open because his daughter graduated high school the day of the first round and he couldn't make it back in time. There are transcendent figures still. They're not at the level of Tiger Woods, but then who was going to be at the level of Tiger Woods anyway? And Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer were that level before Tiger Woods, and it may be another generation until we see somebody take over in that way and be as dominant. But the fact that here we have Spieth and Tiger are the only two now in the modern era of golf, which doesn't go back terribly long, relative to the dinosaurs, the only two guys who've won 10 career titles before the age of 24. So maybe Spieth is that guy, and we're just waiting for him to break out. It seems like he may have broken out. Now, is he Tiger Woods? Of course not. But I got news for you. Tiger Woods isn't Tiger Woods anymore either.
Did you have a problem with the celebration, or was that another social media gasoline that didn't need to be there?
No, that was, to me, as
because if that's in baseball, if
that's
a bat flip, he's getting thrown. in baseball.
But if it's the end of the World Series, then he's not, right? I mean, if he
You're
just
right.
hit a home run, if Joe Carter had done that in 1993 with the with the bat flip, and I think it would have been okay. I mean, we're still celebrating Joe Carter's home run. It's almost 25 years later. No, and what made it really cool to me was not only did he do, the whole thing with the flinging the club and then the chest bump with the caddy, but he had the presence of mind to go back to the green. First of all, he did a little low five with Berger, which was great. But the fact that he then quieted the crowd down so that Berger could hit the putt and potentially send it to a second hole of sudden death, which would have been phenomenal. Just the fact that he was cool enough to do that's an A+ in my book.
I tell you what, and it was the perfect tournament, I think, for that to happen because it's the week after the U.S. Open.
Right.
Not many people across the national landscape will watch golf outside of the four major championships, but you woke up Monday morning, you saw that highlight, and you were talking about golf not in a major championship sense.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that.
For a fan of the sport, that was awesome to see, and it was great to see, and the people who were upset about it, just as you said earlier, people look to be angry sometimes.
Well,
as Michael Caine said in a Batman movie, some people just want to watch the world burn.
Those are the people who would call up when they see a blade of grass move on their backswing and say, he cheated.
Yep. Mark, I appreciate the time. It's always fun catching up with you. Glad to be back in New York and get to see you and do this in person. Mark Renee, sports director at 1010 Wins, morning anchor there as well. One of the largest stations in the world, and the guy right at the forefront of it in the New York media market. Thanks, appreciate it.
Thanks, buddy. Welcome home.
Thanks.
So that was Tuesday. As you heard Mark talk a lot about June 27th, we were touching on a number of different things. We talked about Phil Jackson and what it does for his legacy, what possible moves there are now for the Knicks. And then we woke up Wednesday morning to find that the Knicks and Phil Jackson were parting ways. And although we can't really say that we should be surprised by this, it does kind of make some of the things Mark and I were talking about a little bit irrelevant in that sense. However, a great man who had an opportunity to be around the Knicks for a long period of time, long before Phil Jackson's days with the squad, and who knows quite a bit. He is the founder emeritus of thenixblog.com on Sportsnet New York. You can also catch him at thepatreon.com/Tommy D. He is Tommy D. How is morale right now in the Big Apple?
There's never a dull moment, Christian, especially when we're talking about the Knicks. I've been doing this for, going on more than 10 years, and I've been a fan way longer than that. But, I was woken up this morning about 4 o'clock a.m., and I'm generally up around 5 with my son. But I figured, I figured there was going to be some bad news, someone got hurt or someone died or something. That's usually how that goes when you get those 4 a.m. texts. But certainly shocking news considering, kind of where Phil has been in terms of, how much work he's been doing with deals. Obviously the Porzingis thing on draft night, and, he's pretty busy. It's interesting, and just about 18 or so days ago, James Dolan said if you have any questions regarding the Knicks to ask Phil, that's what he's here for. So obviously over the course of a couple of weeks, or in the New York Minute, things changed, and Jackson's no longer here. I think if to answer the morale question, it's directly, people, I don't know, some Melo fans are celebrating some sort of victory. Knicks fandom, and this is media driven, it's become so low that they don't win anything else. They figure they have to kind of create their own wins and losses. So obviously, if people were pro Phil, that's a loss for them, and if they were pro Melo, because there's this whole Phil versus Melo narrative. So Melo fans are happy. I guess Porzingis fans are happy. But people who wanted stability in the front office and are tired of constant turnover and turmoil probably don't feel so great today.
How did we get here? Because 3 years ago when Phil arrived, there was so much excitement in New York City, and over the last couple of weeks it feels as though we've been waiting for that other shoe to drop. And now, as you say, Carmelo fans, Porzingis fans, Knicks fans in general seem to be as excited to see him leave as they were to see Phil Jackson arrive in the Big Apple.
When he arrived, and I actually said the same thing about Isaiah Thomas. When Isaiah was here, obviously his track record was not great, and when he left here, it was not great either. But these guys are Hall of Famers. These guys understand the game. These guys know people around the league. You know, if you can't win, and I know people say, well, you didn't have the executive experience. Executive experience is basically just overseeing people that you put into play. So from that standpoint, you know, Phil's track record and what his legacy is not good, obviously, with the hiring of Derek Fisher. He has had problems before they parted ways with Jeff Hornacek, I was told. So, you know, his management was ultimately what, you know, really didn't come through. But when he came in, you said to yourself, this guy's won 11 rings. You know, if you can't win with this guy, who can you win with? And, you know, I guess everybody just really, really goes back to 20 years ago and the day that Pat Riley faxed in his resume as, you know, really the last time they had someone here. You know, Donnie Walsh was here for a couple of years. But, you know, Riley, I think they still to this day rue the day that Riley faxed in his resume because had he been here, they had the guy in Riley in my mind.
He's Tommy D, founder emeritus of the New York Knicks blog.com on Sportsnet New York, as well as you can find him on patreon.com/Tommy D. You mentioned with Carmelo, it seemed like a couple weeks ago we were talking about buying out Carmelo for this deal for Phil Jackson to appease him, but now it seems as though his firing by James Dolan was almost to appease Carmelo or appease Porzingis, his biggest stars, or was this a decision from James Dolan just to get rid of him? Was this a business decision from James Dolan, or was this more to appease some of the biggest stars that he has?
Well, when I first heard about it and I thought about it, I said to myself, you know, maybe this is Carmelo's way of being able to, you know, bring in Chris Paul, which obviously can't be the case now because he just got traded. So, you know, was this a situation of Carmelo going to Dolan and saying, listen, these guys won't come here if Phil is in that seat, so, you know, we need to make something happen. Obviously, that's not the case. Carmelo has been, we were the first to report Carmelo was not happy being here, being booed. You know, he wanted to go to Cleveland. They talked about a deal that ultimately that Phil Jackson turned down, which was for Kevin Love. And I think that probably will go down as one of his bigger mistakes in not bringing back Love, getting something for Melo. You could have spun Love to Boston and probably gotten that Brooklyn pick next year, or at least a couple of other you know, younger players and maybe a future pick. But where Carmelo goes from here is anyone's guess. I mean, obviously, we talked about the relationship with his son, and certainly he has a situation happening with his family. So he's got to figure that in terms of logistics. But clearly, to me, he wants to go play with LeBron because he's not leaving New York to go to another team to make a finals, because that doesn't help his legacy at all. I think from a legacy battle that he and Phil had, that was their real rift. You know, and Phil was trying to help Carmelo's legacy by saying, listen, man, just go someplace else, but let's make a reasonable deal happen. And that's ultimately what they couldn't do.
You mentioned the word legacy. What does this do now for the legacy of Phil Jackson? I mean, yeah, he's got 11 rings, but this failed attempt as a executive or in the front office, does this hurt the aura that is Phil Jackson?
What I came to learn about Phil is that he's competitive a guy as you'll ever meet. And I think sometimes that can be hyperbolic, but that it seemed as if he really wanted to put himself on the level of Pat Riley, on the level of Jerry West, at the level of Brett Auerbach. Certainly, you know, he fancies himself in that category, probably on top of that list as a coach, but there's always, you know, another challenge for people who have that sort of mindset. So I think, you know, without risk, there's no reward, there's no glory. I think he's comfortable with who he is. He's comfortable with his rings and his legacy as a coach. But I think this is certainly, you know, absolutely the worst scenario that he could have ever expected for his what we think is going to be his last chapter. I mean, everything was lined up perfectly. He could come here, you know, he could bring a couple of players, you know, to pair with Carmelo, you know, and that certainly, as much as Phil gets knocked for that, players didn't want to come play with Melo either, so Melo has to take his side of the blame on that as well. Lined up perfectly for him to come back come back to New York where it all started, and end this glorious chapter. But as we know in life, things, are not a fairy tale, and that certainly wasn't the case here, or that certainly was the case here.
Well, where do the Knicks go from here? I mean, I haven't heard any names. You've had some time to digest this news. Is there a guy out there? Is Dan Griffin a possibility? Is there someone out there right now to become the new president of the Knicks?
Yeah, that's a great one, just to kind of see if you can get into play for LeBron. Obviously, LeBron would never have saw it coming here, even if he is thinking about leaving Cleveland with Phil Jackson here. The name that really jumped out at me when we got the press release earlier today, about 9:30, was Tim Lewicki, who is the CEO of AEG. And AEG owns the Staples Center, and they own the Lakers, and he's a very well-respected CEO in the entertainment business and the ticketing business. And he has obviously had relationships in Toronto as well, so that's where Masai Ujiri's name comes up there. Other names, I mean, it is what it is with the Garden, right? I mean, it just seems everybody who comes in there has to have some sort of connection with Steve Mills or, some other executives in the front office, and certainly have to have the trust of the owner. And, so from outside the organization, it's going to be interesting. I'm not sure how long the list will be. But then to bring in Masai, you've got to go out and you're actually going to have to give up compensation, probably in the form of draft picks. And, everybody was very critical about Phil, don't ever trade draft picks, save all your draft picks. And he did that. It was a criticism that so many executives in the past had heard. Obviously Donnie Walsh traded so many for Carmelo, and leading into the chase for LeBron, Glenn Grunwald did the same thing with Bargnani when they thought the window was closing. So, they're going to have to give up something if they're going to want to entertain the conversation with Toronto. And I think Masai will definitely listen. He'd come here for that money for sure. But can they make a deal happen quickly? I guess that's the question.
He's Tommy D, founder emeritus of the New York Knicks blog.com on Sportsnet New York. You can also find him on the patreon.com/Tommy D. Final thing before I let you go here, you brought him up a little bit ago, but Chris Paul being traded to the Houston Rockets. In exchange, the Clippers are going to get a number of players, including Patrick Beverley, Sam Decker, Lou Williams, and the Rockets' first-round pick in 2018. Couple of things. Number one, your thoughts on the deal as itself as it stands, and then number two, your thoughts on the possibility of Chris Paul being able to coexist with James Harden down there in Houston for the Rockets.
First and foremost, that gives you an idea of the trade market for Carmelo Anthony, I think. Chris Paul obviously is an all-time great player. Certainly, I think has had a better career than Carmelo, but I'd say at least that gives you an idea. If you were to try to trade Melo, you're going to get back a lot of loose change and, maybe a draft pick. Phil knew what that market was, so it'll be interesting to see, what the new GM does with the idea of potentially trading Melo. But as far as Paul, it's a steal for Houston if James Harden can play off the ball and if Paul can play off the ball. And both have had the ball in their hands for so many years that it's hard to kind of picture the two of them playing on the same floor together. Houston's success stems directly from Harden being able to break people down in pick and roll, score, and get to the free throw line, which is what Paul does. So I've yet to see an offense where that actually can coexist with 2 point guards in the same space. Like Portland does it with Lillard and McCullough, but they don't run a lot of just space. They run a lot of continuity. They run McCullough off screens. And that's really not D'Antoni's type of offense. D'Antoni really is just very cut and dry, space, pick and roll, and pick your poison. And they have the shooters now surrounding all of those guys. So that actually is going to take one spot shooter off the floor, which I think is interesting. And I wouldn't say this because, he's obviously probably out of the league by now, I believe, or if he is, he's just barely hanging on. But it's sort of similar to when they made the Lawson move. When they brought Ty Lawson in there, I thought to myself, I just don't see how this is going to work because both guys rely on the ball and rely on having space to be effective. They're not good off-the-ball players. And when you talk about off-the-ball players, you talk about guys who are very comfortable attacking off the catch. And, when you catch and hold and wait for a screen, that doesn't really do much to the defense. That allows the defense to reset itself. So it's going to be very interesting. I don't see it as an ideal fit, but, Chris Paul is one of the greatest players of all time. So let's see if he can become a role player. And that's something that I've always thought when you talk about guys like Iverson, you talk about guys like Marbury, you talk about guys like Baron Davis, those guys quickly got out of the league because they weren't able to play off the ball and they weren't able to adjust to play a role. And, I'll be very interested to see if Chris Paul can.
Tommy, I appreciate the time, especially on short notice. Great insight. Thanks a lot once again, and best of luck the rest of this offseason there in New York with the Knicks.
I really appreciate it, Christian. Thanks for giving me a call.
That's Tommy D, founder emeritus of the KnicksBlog.com, Sportsnet New York, as well as the Patreon.com/Tommy D. Interesting note there on the Chris Paul deal and how he pretty much feels that's the trade market for Carmelo Anthony. I don't really see much of a deal for him, to be 100% honest. I mean, if you're the Knicks right now and you don't want to keep Carmelo Anthony around, you have to start building around Kristaps Porzingis. And the only way you're going to do that is if you can get some young guys like a Patrick Beverley type to maybe come in there and run with that squad, or you can start getting some draft picks. But I don't think there is any real trade value for Carmelo Anthony right now because who wants to go play with him? He has always been on a team without any other superstars, and he hasn't been able to bring anybody in. He hasn't been able to make anybody else better around him. So I think Phil was right in to say that he should go seek opportunity. Now, I also agree with Tommy that Phil probably should have flipped him for Kevin Love when he had the chance, and then maybe sold Kevin up to Boston for a draft pick or elsewhere. But, who knows? I think a lot of it is going to depend. The future of Carmelo Anthony and the future of the Knicks depends on who this next general manager is. And I brought up Dan Griffin only in the fact that there's a basketball executive who was able to get LeBron to come back to Cleveland. And LeBron has always had a little bit of a rift between ownership, not necessarily front office, but ownership. You've heard him in multiple interviews where he has said the guy who owns the team. He won't even call Dan Griffith by his name. But his old GM coming into New York, who knows? That could spell the possible acquirement of LeBron James next summer. Who knows what that means for the Knicks? All I know is that their future goes based off of who is signed as the next GM. And I've always felt this, that sports work best when the coach or the manager in baseball and the GM have a great personality and a great relationship, because it's when the GM can respect what the coach is trying to do on the floor that he goes out and gets the players the coaches need. And it's when the coach respects the limitations the GM has that he works within those limitations. And I don't think the Knicks have seen that in a long time. It doesn't help that you have an owner who, for whatever reason, doesn't know what he's doing. The guy who brought back Isaiah Thomas multiple times. But that's just James Dolan. And he's a larger-than-life personality who doesn't know how to stay out of his own way. But that's what a lot of owners in sports are. The best owners and the best teams are the ones who have owners stay out of the way. Look at the New England Patriots. You see Robert Kraft as the owner. You don't see him out making outlandish comments, going on radio shows talking about how one of the greatest of all time has been banned from the arena for life, whatever that is. You don't. So more people should probably be looking at the Patriots and how they run things. That's probably, in my mind, one of the better ways to go. On Press Row, I'm Christian Heimall. So glad to have you guys as a part of the show. We took it on the road this week. We had a lot of fun talking about a number of different things. I want to touch back on something that Mark Renee and I were touching on. And I brought this up last week with Cody Ortner of Bruce Sports Network, our golf correspondent, about is there an actual face of golf? And I don't necessarily agree with Mark in that there doesn't need to be one. I think there does, because to attract the non-avid avid golf fan, to attract the casual sports fan, you need that storyline. And it can't be, will Jordan Spieth rebound? Can Rory McIlroy find his form? Is Dustin Johnson finally healthy? Will Phil Mickelson finally get his first U.S. Open? You can't have those things. You need things like, can Dustin Johnson continue his dominance? Can Jordan Spieth finally complete the career Grand Slam? And he's the next Tiger Woods, so he's going to be put the pressure on him to be the face of golf. But I loved the celebration after he holed out in the playoff hole. I thought it was awesome. I think the people who are upset about it need to grow up and go back inside their house instead of screaming for everybody to get off their lawn. And Mark brought it up. He not only did he celebrate tremendously, which was awesome and great to see, and the type of celebration that is needed in today's age. Golf is an antiquated sport, but it is dominated by younger players. And to see the raw emotion of a younger player is what is going to bring that non-casual golf fan, that non-avid watcher into the game. You saw Tiger always doing it with the fist bump. You saw Jack Nicklaus tossing the putter in the air. You've seen it from a number of different guys. Usually it's when they win a major, yes, but that kind of shot warranted it. That hole out from the bunker on the playoff hole was tremendous. And then Jordan, in true gentleman's fashion, because they all call golf a gentleman's sport, in true gentleman's fashion, he calmed the crowd down so that his opponent could attempt to hit a shot that could have sent it to a second playoff hole. So, all I'm going to say is, boys will be boys. The celebration was awesome. Golf should embrace stuff like that, because that will bring more people in to the sport. It will. It's a lot of fun. I love seeing it. Now, I'm also one of those guys who thinks the bat flip in baseball, when done in the right spot, is awesome. When you're down 5-1 and you hit a solo shot in the 8th inning on the road, Jose Bautista? No. But when you hit an absolute mammo in a playoff game at home, that deserves a bat flip. Jose Bautista. Right place, right situation, it's awesome. And it needs to be embraced. So I'm happy for Jordan Spieth. I loved it. Been a lot of fun this week. Glad we were able to take the show on the road. My thanks to Mark Renee for joining me, as well as for Tommy D. Again, check them out on Twitter. You can check us out on Twitter at Bruce Sportsnet. You can follow me and ask me any question you'd like to be part of next week's show at Chris Heimall. Until then, I hope everybody has a great weekend. Enjoy it. We'll see you next week on Press Row.